Chapter 2, The Homegang. March 30th dawned clear and bright over the coastal city of Kazmorian. Its people woke early and started their morning rituals, eating their breakfast and offering prayers to their holy desert gods, the numerous unseen Djinn who watched over them. The strange-sounding call to worship was uttered by the white-robed and grey-bearded high clerics to gather the people into the temples that dotted the city. The call sounded like a mixture of joyful singing and mournful crying. The intoxicating smell of burning incense and other offerings wafted into the crowded streets. Within a few moments the streets were empty except for homeless vagabonds, cripples and beggars. The air above the temples appeared to shimmer slightly. If one looked closely one could see the transparent silhouette of a man's upper torso. There were many see-through torsos, hovering over the domed roof and peaked turrets of the temples. A few of them drifted down and entered the temples through their opened arched doorways. When the worshippers noticed their arrivals they let out a cry that consisted of equal parts of elation and fear. They threw themselves face down onto the stone floor. They screamed and cried out, praising the Djinn and begging it to show them mercy. The Djinn silently passed over them and made its way to the altar at the head of the congregation. It collected the offerings in its unseen arms and left the temple. Those who it passed over screamed in joyful terror, believing that they were now either blessed or cursed by the Djinn. Once the Djinn left the temple the people rose to their feet, all visibly shaken. They listened to the high cleric recite passages and hymns from the holy books, handed down to them from the prophets. The people sang in praise to their desert gods and devoted themselves to the Djinn. While they did this, the Djinn howled and cackled with cruel laughter, mocking their worshippers as idiots and fools for believing that they were really gods. When the Djinn had first encountered the children of the sands they had told them that they were gods as a joke, believing that the people would catch on eventually to their jest. But instead of being exposed for the frauds that they are, the Djinn were still thought to be gods by the children of the sands. "Ya think they'd avenue figged it out by now," laughed one. "They'd be too stupid and ya know it," argued a second. "Think they ever will?" asked a third. "Nah, like he says," replied a fourth, "they be too stupid." "This be the best gig we ever pulled, says I," howled a fifth. All the Djinn laughed. If anyone had heard their uncouth speech it is highly unlikely that it would have been intelligible to them. To any eavesdropper all they would have heard would have been the desert wind and the swirling sand. The Djinn were not gods at all but were instead bodiless wraiths, doomed to wander the wilds for eternity. They were notorious among the Arthurians who knew about their true nature. They knew the Djinn as tricksters, liars, thieves and cruel killers. Jofla, they called them, meaning demons. The Djinn both hated and feared the Arthurians. Once upon a time they had been great and powerful, equal to any Arthurian they came across. But that had been during the time when the Arthurians had been enslaved to the Farodin, before they had freed themselves and shattered the old kingdom. Many a Djinni had been killed by the Arthurians and the desert wraiths avoided them whenever they could. As the Djinn continued to laugh at their worshippers they squabbled over the offerings that had been left for them. They grappled and fought with each other for the rich food and especially over the fine red wine. During their tussles they knocked many of the offerings off of the temple's roofs. The dishes and platters crashed to the ground and were instantly set upon by the dozens and dozens of street urchins and beggars, all of whom were bone-thin and clothed in rags. The wretches were eager to take advantage of the food from the gods. They greedily devoured the discarded food and fought one another for every little scrap, down to the smallest crumb. The biggest of the beggars always got the most. The weaker ones waited for the leftovers like whipped dogs. One of the smaller men argued with another over a beef bone that had almost been picked perfectly clean. When the other man refused to share and turned his back, the first man drew out his curved Janbir dagger and slit his throat. He quickly scooped up the beef bone and scuttled off deeper into the back alleys. Several of the Djinn had stopped their bickering to watch the beggars fighting and they laughed when they saw the act of murder being committed. Their eyes, however, were not the only ones to see this. "Disgusting little sand swine," the Sulian lieutenant sneered through his gas mask as he watched the murder scuttling off. "Yes they are, aren't they?" said the ensign as he looked on. "They do this call to prayer every morning?" asked the lieutenant. "No. Only on certain days," replied the ensign. By now the crowd of beggars had finished their ravenous feasting and had noticed the two Sulian officers and their accompanying squad of marines. The largest of the wretches and the unofficial leader rose to his feet and bowed to the Sulians. "Salam O my lords of Sulia," he said as he straightened. "May I ask what you are doing and where you are going?" "That's none of your business, Sandy," spat the ensign. "We're going to the palace of your sultan," answered the lieutenant. The ensign glanced quickly at the lieutenant, then back at the big man. Confident as usual, he thought, let's hope it's not overconfidence you're filled with, sir. Truly, said the big man, you go the embodiment of paradise on earth. You must be the man who had His Highness order the Royal Army to prepare to march south. I am, replied the lieutenant, care to join this campaign. I am certain that your Sultan would be happy to accept you into his army. Ha! What an ignorant Suli you are, laughed the big man. He held up his right hand to show that the pinky finger was missing and that an X had been branded into the back of the knuckles. I am a marked man, said the lout, His Highness would never take me into the ranks of the army. Nor would he want to, Yusef, said another beggar, you're only good for thieving and burglary. And you'd eat him out of house and home before he could get any work out of you, said a second man. All the beggars laughed, including big Yusef. The ensign felt uneasy. He wasn't sure if the lieutenant had noticed it or not, but the beggars were drawing closer. Not only that, they had started to spread out as if to surround the detachment. He saw that a few of them were wearing daggers on their belts, but he was certain that all of them had shanks stuffed up their tattered sleeves. Sir, the ensign said under his breath, danger close. Since you can't join the Sultan's army, said the lieutenant, his voice calm and even, would you consider joining the Sulian army as auxiliaries? Yusef gave the lieutenant a sidelong look and arched his thick bushy eyebrow. The beggars, now almost cheek to jowl with the Marines, stopped in their tracks. Auxilia futter, he said, I do not know this word. What does it mean? It means that you would become members of the Sulian army under my command, answered the lieutenant. The ensign nearly lost his composure at this. Sand swine, joining the army, he thought, are you bloody mad? You would take us into your ranks, asked Yusef, taking a step towards the lieutenant. The lieutenant had to crane his head back to look up at the big man who stood head and shoulders above him. I would, replied the lieutenant. Why? Demanded Yusef. Frankly, I need all the manpower I can get, said the lieutenant, besides, it's in your best interest. You'd be getting regular meals and a roof over your head. Anything else? Asked Yusef. The beggars perked up their ears to listen in. As they did this, they failed to notice the Marines sergeant major leveling his MP-40 submachine gun at Yusef. The man was well within striking distance of both officers. If Yusef made any sudden moves, he wouldn't know what hit him. If he kills the half-breed lieutenant, fine, thought the sergeant major, but he better not kill the ensign. Yusef stroked his bearded chin as he thought on the lieutenant's offer. The other beggars waited to see what their leader would do. A few of them quietly slipped their hands into the ragged robes and wrapped their fingers around the handles of the homemade knives. If Yusef decided against enlisting, then they would, agreed, the big man suddenly said. The other beggars were taken aback by this. They had expected Yusef to give them the order to kill the Sulians. But Yusef was the leader, and where he went the others followed. Good, said the lieutenant, now that you are under my command I will issue you your first order. Lead us to the Sultan's palace. We seem to have gotten ourselves turned around in this city. The lieutenant gave the ensign a hard look for an instant. I said I knew a shortcut, the ensign said defensively. In my experience, growled the lieutenant, shortcuts inevitably turn into long cuts. As you wish, Effendi, said Yusef with a low bow. This way and watch your step. We'll be heading through the livestock market and the beasts have an annoying habit of not cleaning up after themselves. Lead on, said the lieutenant. The big man turned and beckoned for the Sulians to follow. The lieutenant ordered the detachment of Marines to forward march, but simultaneously motioned to the sergeant major to signal the men to ready their weapons. The sergeant major nodded. The rest of the vagabonds were now mixed in with the ranks of the Marines, laughing and hooting like the ruffians they were. They slapped the soldiers on the back and told them that they were now brothers in arms, and honored to fight for the greater glory of Sulia. None of the sand children noticed that the Marines were flicking off their rifles' safeties. The Marines already had bullets chambered, their rifles cocked and bayonets fixed, as was standard practice when going ashore. If the tramps attempted to ambush them, then the Sulians would be ready to defend themselves. They were almost hoping that they would. The people spilled out of the temples and resumed their daily affairs. Soon the streets and alleyways were packed. As the Sulians pushed their way through the crowds, they could hear the braying of donkeys, the lowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep and goats. The animals milled about in their pens and watched the soldiers march by. The Sulians paid the beasts no mind and continued on their way. And then the smell hit them. Even though they were all wearing gas masks, they could still smell the mountains of steaming manure laying in stalls next to them. Next to the mounds were signs with the words, "Fertilizer for sale," painted across the boards. "Oh good God, that smell," gagged the ensign. Yusef looked back over his shoulder and smiled when he saw him retching. He could also see that the other soldiers were suffering as well, but they were concealing their discomfort with masterful discipline. "Liking the fresh air, sir?" asked the big man. "Shut up and move," he gasped, breathing through his mouth. "As you wish, Effendi," replied Yusef. The beggars laughed, unaffected by the heavy stench. They had long grown used to it. Yusef led them to a more open part of the market, near an auction block. They had just missed the bidding for an elephant that had been sold for 30,000 dinars, which was the equivalent of $300. The new owner was an old man who wore the rich red silken robes and bejeweled rings of the Kazmoranian elites. Yusef made a point of knocking the old man out of his way. The elderly merchant fell to the ground in a heap. Cursing and swearing in his desert tongue, he looked up to shout at Yusef. The big beggar was so well known that virtually everyone in the city knew him by sight. He was about to curse the beggar when he saw the Sulian lieutenant gazing down at him. The officer held his gloved hands behind his back. Funny how all old people look the same when they're on their hands and knees, he thought as he continued to stare at the man. He was suddenly reminded of the old man he had killed back in Empire City, the one who had been concealing his quarry. What was his name? Lazarus. The lieutenant had shot him through the forehead when he refused to tell him where Myra had been hiding. Old fool died for nothing, thought the officer as the aged merchant rose to his feet. "Yusef, you son of a fatherless dog," the old man shouted, "may the Djinn wither your hands." "Is that all you can say?" scoffed the big man. "You witless, oafish, stupid, thick-headed, brainless son of a goat," the white-bearded elder cried. "Ah, that's more like it," laughed Yusef. "All that cursing for just being knocked over," thought the Sulian lieutenant, arching an eyebrow. "Have you no respect for your elders, you brute?" asked the black-robed, grey-bearded auctioneer who had sold the elephant to the elderly merchant. "No, I do not," replied Yusef, "at least, not for this old husk of a dried banana peel." The horde of beggars cackled at this. "Banana peel," yelled the old man indignantly. "Yes, banana peel," Yusef answered, "I knock you over so many times a week you might as well have them tied to your feet." A chorus of shouting erupted at that moment. The auction goers, led by the old merchant, demanded that Yusef apologize for disrupting the sales. The gaggle of beggars and vagabonds demanded that the auction goers apologize to the Sulians for being in their way. The Sulians, meanwhile, were caught in the middle, unable to move. They held their rifles at the ready, fingering their triggers. "And I thought the infighting in Empire City was petty," thought the lieutenant as he stood at the very center of the maddening crowd. He rubbed his temples, his eyes sealed shut, feeling the beginnings of a headache coming on. He was starting to regret not shooting Yusef and the rest of the beggars when he had had a legitimate reason. The tramps were currently telling the auction goers that they were now part of the Sulian army and were thus socially above them. The wealthy merchants hated the homeless, dirty tramps on general principle, but at hearing this they became flushed in the face and roared what they thought of them. "To hell with this," growled the lieutenant, drawing out his .08 Luger. He fired a shot into the air, causing all the sand children to jump away from him. The two sides were split down the middle with the Sulians standing between them, shouldering their rifles. "Anyone who continues to disturb the peace will be arrested," shouted the lieutenant. None of the auction-going sand children said a word. Big Yusef and his beggars crossed their arms over their chests with smug looks on their dirty, unkempt faces. "That includes auxiliary units as well," growled the lieutenant, giving the wretches a sidelong look. Yusef's face flushed red, but he remained silent. The wealthy sand children smiled grimly at this. The lieutenant turned to Yusef, holstered his pistol, clasped his hands behind his back and said, "Please lead my men and me to the main streets." "With pleasure, Effendi," replied Yusef with a bow. The big man marched forward and the crowd parted before him. The Sulians and their beggar parasites left the auction block. "I thought that we were going to have to shoot our way out of here, sir," the ensign said to the lieutenant in Sulian. "Don't let your guard down yet," the lieutenant replied in the same language, "we just might have to." "Out of the way. Get out of our way," boomed Yusef, "make way for our glorious overlords." As they wound through the streets, past the bazaars and crowded market stalls, the Sulians could feel the eyes of the locals drilling holes in the backs of their helmeted heads. Hostilities hung heavy in the air. The Marines, though highly disciplined and drilled, were beginning to feel nervous. Each time the big beggar called them glorious overlords, they could feel another layer of tension drape over the crowd. "Shut up, you moron," whispered one of the troopers, "you're going to start a riot with that big mouth of yours." The trooper had more reason to be anxious than he knew. Yusef had started several riots in the past. He did this occasionally for his own amusement, but normally he did this to conceal his stealing. Sometimes he falsely accused one of the stall vendors of cheating his customers. Other times he told everyone who would listen that someone had been overheard disrespecting the Djinn, a crime which was punishable by either beheading or the loss of a hand, but never saying just who it was. And yet other times he would go about accusing certain men of having affairs with the wives of other men. Indeed, Yusef had become greatly skilled at starting riots and profiting from them. It was, however, a talent that he used sparingly and never in the same place twice. Yusef was a brute, but he was by no means a stupid man. He knew that if he started a riot in the same place he would eventually get caught. The bazaar he was currently marching through, however, had yet to experience his handiwork. He correctly judged the mood of the crowd, sour but not quite angry enough to act. A few more verbal prods would do the trick. Make way, he cried in his native tongue. Make way, you fleas, you dogs, you misbegotten spawn of serpents. Can't you see that your betters are trying to get through? Aren't you aware that they're going to the Sultan's palace to tell His Highness how to run this city? Make way, make way. The crowd at first began to grumble amongst themselves, saying how the Sulians were throwing their weight around the city. A group of fishermen growled and groaned about how the battleship that had brought the Sulians was scaring away all the fish that they caught in the bay. A pack of merchants complained bitterly how sections of the docks had been labeled as off-limits by the Marines. A group of sailors told the others how the jetties had become choked with Sulian cargo and war supplies, so choked that they couldn't get to their begalas. A group of veiled women told how the Sulians had accosted them in the streets, uttering catcalls and wolf whistles at them. The anger broiled and bubbled until it was ready to burst. At first the crowd only threw insults and curses at the Marines, but then someone, one of Yusef's beggars as it turned out, threw an apple. The bright red fruit struck the trailing Marine in the back of the head and splattered all over his helmet. With that, more fruits and vegetables were tossed. Apples and cabbages seemed to be the favorite choices for the Sand Children, although there were a few tomatoes mixed in. Along with these there was at least one pineapple that struck a corporal in the small of his back, nearly bowling him over. Get out of here, the people shouted at the Sulians. Get out of Kazmorian. Go back to where you came from. Sulis, go home. To hell with your emperor. The Sulians endured the barrage of produce and words, continuing to march forward with masterful discipline. They didn't break formation nor slow their pace. They stared straight ahead, ignoring the raving crowd that howled for their blood. They also failed to notice that the beggars who had been marching with them were now gone. The wretches knew what was coming next and they wanted to get into position to exploit the coming chaos. "Sir," asked the ensign. "What?" the lieutenant replied. "Permission to put the locals in their place," requested the ensign. "Not yet," answered the lieutenant, "wait for the stones." "Stones, sir?" asked ensign. "You'll see in less than a minute," said the lieutenant. The crowd continued to shout and scream at the Sulians. The cries drew more and more of the Sand Children to the site until there were at least 300 people lining the narrowing streets. They cursed the foreign soldiers, calling them heretics to the Djinn and spawn of the devil. Yusef smiled to himself as he continued to lead the way. He glanced over his shoulder to see the troopers being bombarded with a near-continuous barrage of garbage. The men ducked and dodged the blows as best they could, but it was almost impossible. Their uniforms were now stained with grease, dirt and other things that smelled of mold and decay. The men no longer marched erect but were now bowed with hunched shoulders. Yusef smiled and laughed on the inside when he saw this. He loved to see the supposedly superior race being so openly rejected. They were all cowering now. All, that is, save for the lieutenant who strode proudly through the barrage with his hands clasped tightly behind his back. He only moved his arms to readjust his officer's cap that was hit every now and then by a flying piece of filth. He completely ignored the rioters as if they were nothing more than mere shadows. That troubled Yusef greatly. He still couldn't see the man's face due to his gas mask, but he could see his eyes through his lenses. Those eyes burned like fire, the fire of pent-up rage and hate. With each second that passed, the fire burned hotter and brighter until Yusef was forced to look away. The big beggar shuddered. He'd never before seen anyone with eyes like that. "I'd best get this over with," he thought as he looked up to the roofs of the overhanging buildings. He nodded to the figures who were partly hidden from view and they nodded in reply. With the signal sent, Yusef quickened his pace and soon outstripped the Sulians. "Hey, where'd the big bastard go?" asked the ensign as he wiped tomato splat from his eyes. "Get ready," said the lieutenant, stopping in his tracks. "Halt." The sergeant major roared to the Marines when he saw that the officers had stopped moving. Had the Sulians looked up at that moment, they would have seen the roof-bound figures drawing their arms back. Stones, rocks and broken bits of masonry were in their hands. They picked their targets among both the Sulians and the crowd below and threw with all their strength. The smaller rocks dinged and bounced off the Sulians' helmets while the larger one broke collarbones and shattered shoulder blades. One of the Sulians fell to the ground with a cracked skull. As soon as the crowd saw that rocks were now being thrown, they too began to stone the Marines. "That's all the excuse I need," thought the lieutenant. "Open fire," he roared as loudly as he could. The Marines were only too happy to obey. With a battle cry of "Sulia," they brought their rifles up to their shoulders, took aim at the closest rioter, be they man, woman or child, and fired at point-blank range. 27 people fell dead within the first volley. The children of the sands realized too late that they had incurred the wrath of the most bloodthirsty men in history and tried to flee. They screamed in terror as they stampeded away from the soldiers, all the while more and more of their fellows were being shot around them. The street was too narrow for the mass of people to pass through without being crushed. Then they heard the lieutenant cry, "Frag out," and an explosion tore through the packed crowd. More hand grenades were thrown and blew up among the retreating rioters. Then they heard the lieutenant scream, "Charge bayonets," and the Marines howled in bloodlust. They chased after the fleeing people, driving their sharpened steel through those who lagged behind. Both the lieutenant and the ensign had drawn their pistols and were firing into the crowd. The corporals, sergeants and the sergeant major were all carrying MP-40 submachine gun and were likewise blasting indiscriminately into the fleeing crowd. When the dust had settled and the smoke cleared, 199 bodies lay strewn on the street. Many had been shot while others had been trampled to death. All of the corpses were covered in blood. "Sound off," shouted the lieutenant. The men called out their names while the ensign took stock of their casualties. When he was finished, he saluted the lieutenant and said, "All men accounted for, sir." One man was wounded, Private Thieneman. "Is he hurt badly?" asked the lieutenant, still aiming his pistol down the body-choked street. "The medic says he might have a broken skull," replied the ensign. "Will he live?" asked the lieutenant. The ensign's silence was answer enough. "Prepare to move out," barked the sergeant major. "Belay that order, hold your position," countermanded the lieutenant. "Sir?" asked the ensign. "You heard me," answered the lieutenant. "With all due respect, sir, but why the hell are we not withdrawing to the main streets?" "Because we must wait for our guide to return to lead us, there is why," replied the lieutenant. "You mean that big dirty sand swain?" balked the ensign. The lieutenant gave a curt nod. "That son of a bitch was the one who started this whole mess." "I am aware of that, ensign," said the lieutenant. "Then why in Saul's name are we waiting for him? So that he can lead us out of here." The ensign looked at the lieutenant with utter confusion. If he knew that Yusef had intentionally started the riot, why wait for him? Why not just leave and forget about the big bastard? The ensign couldn't see an answer. "It didn't work, they're still alive," hissed the beggar on Yusef's right. The large man was peering around the corner at the Sulian Marines with a mixture of awe and dread. He had hoped that the soldiers would be overwhelmed by the crowd and torn to pieces. Instead, the exact opposite had happened. The crowd had been the one to be butchered. "What do we do now?" asked the smaller man. "What do you think, you fool?" replied Yusef. "We scatter and hide." Just then they heard a sound from behind them, the sound of a rifle's breech bolt being cocked. The two men looked over their shoulders to see one of the Marines aiming his weapon at them. "Oh damn it all," moaned the smaller man as he flung his arms up over his head. "I'm innocent," cried Yusef. "I sincerely doubt that," scoffed the Marine as he motioned for them to move. "Ah, there you are, Yusef," the lieutenant said mockingly. "I was wondering where you had gotten yourself off to." "Effendi, please, I can explain," said the big man. "Please do," said the lieutenant. "Where do you go?" asked the ensign. "Well, you see," stammered Yusef. "Yes," said the lieutenant, "go on." "I am much taller than you and your group," said Yusef. "I can see that," replied the lieutenant. "My legs are longer than yours," continued the big beggar. "I merely outpaced you and your men." The ensign laughed at this. The lieutenant remained silent. He took a step towards Yusef and looked up at him. "I believe you," he said, watching relief sweep over Yusef's face. You're so tall that we couldn't possibly have kept up with you. Not with those long legs of yours. Yusef let out a small sigh. His lie had worked. As for you, said the lieutenant, turning to face the smaller man who stood next to Yusef, there's only one reason for someone of your stature to have outrun us. You were running away. I did run away when they began throwing stones at you, Effendi, answered the little man. So you admit it? Asked the lieutenant. The smaller man nodded, not understanding why he was being asked such a question. Well, this simply will not do. Will not do at all, said the lieutenant. You see, the moment you and your brethren joined me and my men as auxiliaries, you became subject to Sulian military law. When you fled, you deserted your post, which was by my side as any brave soldier should be. The smaller man's swarthy face turned notably paler as he listened. You committed the crime of desertion, cowardice in the face of the enemy even. The ensign looked from the lieutenant to the small man and back again, a knowing smile on his face. I'm afraid that there's only one punishment for such an offense, said the lieutenant as he stepped towards the man. Yusef watched in horror as the officer leveled his pistol and shot the man between his eyes. The small beggar flopped to the ground in a heap. Yusef's mouth went dry. The lieutenant nudged the dead man with his foot to make certain that he was dead. When he was satisfied, he holstered his sidearm and turned to Yusef, clasping his gloved hands behind his back. Let that be a lesson to you, he said as he looked up at the big man. Yusef nodded and gulped. Now that that's over with, will you please lead my men and I out of these godforsaken side streets? Yusef nodded nervously and turned away. Oh, one more thing, Yusef, said the lieutenant. Yusef stopped and turned towards the officer. If you lead us into any more riots, I'll have to assume that you are doing so on purpose and will have you shot as a saboteur and a rebel instigator. Yusef felt himself trembling. Sergeant Major, called the lieutenant. Sir, if this man does lead us into any more ambushes or delays, you are under orders to shoot him. Do I make myself clear? Yes, sir. Perfectly clear, replied the old soldier, leveling his submachine gun at Yusef and drawing back the breech bolt. Right, said the lieutenant, turning to Yusef, which way is the Sultan's palace from here?